Hello, my name is Ken Levinson. I'm an architect, a parent of 2 young girls, and I've been arrested twice in the past year participating in nonviolent civil disobedience as a volunteer in Extinction Rebellion. I'm honored to join the March for Science with you here today. Extinction Rebellion is a global nonviolent movement that combines regenerative culture, autonomous governance, and civil disobedience to rapidly scale protests to compel governments to act with all their power to address our climate and ecological emergency. I'm going to talk for a few minutes here about civil disobedience, about power, and what you might expect in participating in an action of nonviolent civil disobedience. Because despite all our efforts within the system, with the exception of stuff like economic recessions and the current horrifying pandemic, global carbon emissions continue to skyrocket. It's really about the system. And so we need to start by acknowledging our role in that today's messed up power structure exists because we cooperate. We have forfeited our power essentially, and we go along. So to change the system, we must recognize that we have great power in our choices. We need to choose to withdraw our cooperation and use civil disobedience. To change the system, we must not only withdraw our cooperation, but we must make demands. Because as Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. And if we're going to achieve a livable and just planet for all, we really have to act now. Famous examples of nonviolent civil disobedience movements, like the US Civil Rights Movement, tell us a powerful story of regular, normally law-abiding citizens breaking the rules and laws and forcing change on a system that had refused to change. They make clear that business as usual is intolerable. As Martin Luther King Jr. said in remarks about non-cooperation, we merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open where it can be seen and dealt with. So why nonviolence? First, for simply pragmatic reasons. When compared to violent revolts, nonviolent civil disobedience has a better track record of success. Nonviolence allows for mass participation. It allows for regular people like you and me to participate. And with mass participation, the movement is much more resilient, innovative, and creative. In a mass movement, there are roles for everyone to play. Risking arrest is just one role of many. With mass participation, a movement is harder to discredit. And what's fascinating is that all the successful mass movements that jump to mind, Indian independence, US civil rights, ACT UP, and many more, require the participation of just a tiny fraction of the population to win. Nonviolence can also be a moral and physical shield of protection, putting a state in a bind. It creates a dilemma for the state. Do they react or not? If the state overreacts, it can backfire, building more support for the protests. And this sense of dilemma can be heightened with art, theater, song, and even humor. It's really limited only by our imaginations. What nonviolent civil disobedience is not is an act of chaos. Nonviolent civil disobedience is carefully planned with participant training and well-developed discipline. The next planned disruption building on the previous one. So what happens in a planned act of nonviolent civil disobedience? Of course, no two acts of civil disobedience are alike, and depending on many factors, the dynamic can play out very differently. But to show an example of what might happen, I'm going to talk briefly about the first time I got arrested. About a year ago, I signed up with Extinction Rebellion in New York City, and I was asked the question, are you willing to risk arrest? It was a question that gave me pause, but energized me too. With a desire to participate, I attended a nonviolent direct action training, NVDA for short, given by Extinction Rebellion. We learned about the thinking underlying nonviolent civil disobedience. We reviewed the many roles and actions, most not requiring risking arrest. We did mock actions and learned about the many dynamics we might face with a particular focus on de-escalation. That to avoid unpredictable conflict, the emphasis would be on de-escalating tense situations with people you are inconveniencing and likely pissing off. And the training made sure people understood the risks specific to their situation, knew their rights with the police, and could make an informed decision about joining an action or not, and in what capacity. Then, the night before the action, those risking arrest met in a church in Brooklyn Heights. There were about 60 of us. We were broken into smaller groups, and each of us got a buddy to watch out for each other during the action. The action would demand that New York City declare a climate emergency, a stake in the ground, and a simple, significant first step in any government's climate response. The next morning, volunteer support took our cell phones and other non-essential items. We would blend into the street life with our buddy in small group until the decisive moment. As we approached the Brooklyn Bridge at City Hall, a large group of Extinction Rebellion protesters was chanting with signs, banners, and a painted seawall mocking the futile protection a proposed seawall might provide. There was a heavy police presence. They knew something bigger was about to happen, they just didn't know what. Then, the streetlight changed, and suddenly one protester went up a light pole, and another up the opposite pole, and I felt a rush of adrenaline as simultaneously my group and others crossing the street stopped. We locked arms tightly, 2 rows deep, back to back, from curb to curb, preventing the traffic behind us from resuming. Immediately, other groups of arrestables laid down in the street that we were now protecting in a die-in. A large banner was unfurled from the 2 light posts across the intersection, demanding that New York City declare a climate emergency. We were disrupting, we were demanding, chanting, singing. Media was swirling, tourists were watching. Extinction Rebellion outreach people were explaining to stuck drivers what was happening and why. The objective then was to hold the street as long as possible and create as much disruption as possible. A police loudspeaker cut through the chanting in a never-ending loop, saying we were breaking the law and would be arrested if we didn't leave the street. We stayed. Slowly, police approached us one by one, asking us to leave the street. And when we didn't, they handcuffed us behind our backs with zip ties and took us to a police bus where we sat for a couple of hours, singing, sharing some stories, but mostly trying with difficulty to find a comfortable sitting position. Then a 2-block drive to one police plaza, another hour of processing into central booking, and put behind bars. I spent the next 7 hours in the men's holding cell with about 30 other Extinction Rebellion protesters. The 30 women were held separately in cells of 2 or 3. We reflected on our lives, the justice system, how messed up everything is. We stretched, we napped. But slowly, eventually, we were all, well, except for the 2 pole climbers who faced elevated charges and a night in jail, we were one by one released with a desk appearance ticket for a court appearance about 6 weeks later. Once out of jail, support volunteers with our stuff and some food recorded my charges, and after a short conversation, I finally headed back late that night to my family. Weeks later, in court with free representation from the National Lawyers Guild, I faced the judge with a violation of disorderly conduct. The way forward was simple to me: take responsibility, tell the judge why we did it, and plead guilty. I got an ACD, short for Adjournment of Contemplation of Dismissal, which means the violation charge would disappear from my record if I wasn't arrested again in the next 6 months. A few weeks later, I'm happy to report New York City did declare a climate emergency. So I'll conclude by repeating that it's time for us all to find ways to withdraw our consent. And once this pandemic has passed, I look forward to seeing you in the streets. Thank you.